Hello and welcome. Are you someone who believes that telepathy is real? Are you someone who has had a sense of being stared at? And when you've turned around, that sense has proven to be accurate. Someone was staring at you. This isn't coincidence. It's happened time and time and time again, and it's a distinct feeling. Are you someone who looks around this planet and considers the extreme complexity and diversity of life, the insects, creatures, animals, birds, mammals, and says to yourself, there's no way that Darwinian evolutionary theory or neo-Darwinian theory can account for all of this? There's something else in the mix. If so, this may well be the podcast episode for you. Today, I'm going to talk about biologist Rupert Sheldrake, someone who I hold in exceptionally high esteem. A bit of a backstory: I was hoping to speak to Rupert in person. At the moment, he's totally overwhelmed. I'm glad about that because it's great to see him being given such a lot of attention. I had a slightly amusing story about what may have added to that attention, just a little bit, something that I found out about just yesterday, but I'll tell you about that later on in this video. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about him. I want to give you a bit of background. This is just a snippet from his biography. Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist and author of more than 100 scientific papers and 9 books, and the co-author of 6. His books have been published in 28 languages. He was among the top 100 global thought leaders for 2013, as ranked by the Duckweiler Institute, Zurich, Switzerland's leading think tank. His research interest score puts him in the top 4% of scientists, which is extraordinarily impressive. Now, that goes on, and he's credentialed in a way which is impeccable. And yet, when Rupert started talking about his ideas, his theories, he came in for a huge amount of pushback from a lot of people. Some of it was incredibly petty and nasty, in my opinion. No doubt some people still think like that, but it is heartwarming to note that he is now being accepted by more and more people. In fact, more and more people are beginning to realise that his version of what might be happening in terms of this reality is not only profound, but can help us understand part of our existence, what is going on, and this planet. And so what I wanted to do was to move on to Rupert talking about his work. This is a short video clip.
Morphic resonance is a connection across time from the past to the present. And it's a process that occurs between organized patterns of activity on the basis of similarity. What it means, in effect, is that each species has a kind of collective memory. So every giraffe tunes in by morphic resonance to the form and to the behavior of previous giraffes. Every crystal, as it crystallizes, tunes in to the way that previous crystals of the same chemical crystallized in the past. So there's a kind of memory given by morphic resonance in all kinds of things. And in the realm of animal behavior, for example, it leads to quite striking predictions. If rats learn a new trick here in London, then rats all around the world should be able to learn the same trick quicker, just because the rats have learned it here. The more that learn it, the easier it should get everywhere else. And there's already evidence that this actually happens from studies of rats in laboratories. When lots of rats have learned something, other rats all around the world find it easier to learn. And this doesn't depend on any normal kind of connection between the different rats or the places. It happens because of morphic resonance on the basis of similarity.
What I want to do now is to play you a clip of Rupert in conversation talking about birds in this case, and how morphic resonance and morphic fields may explain how they've learned something that they shouldn't really have been able to learn.
Well, this is any spread of behaviour that, the best example from over the 20th century is blue tits, small birds, which steal cream from the top of milk bottles.
Yeah.
Here in Britain, we have deliveries of milk bottles to the doorstep. It still happens. We have them here at our house in London. And when I first started living here about 35 years ago, we had full-fat milk delivered to the doorstep. And most mornings when I go there, I'd find that the aluminium top had been broken open and some of the cream had disappeared.
Yeah.
These small birds were stealing the cream.
Yeah.
Well, this habit started around year 1920 in Southampton, in the south of England. And at the time, amateur bird spotters all over the country took part in a national experiment organised by Cambridge University to track this new behaviour.
Mm.
And they found that it spread locally, but then it showed up 70 or 80 kilometres away, and these birds don't move more than a few kilometres from home. So they thought these must be independent discoveries. And they tracked the independent discovery, and the rate of independent discovery accelerated. So it was accelerating in a way that couldn't just be explained by the birds flying and telling other birds about it.
Yeah.
And the people who were doing this were not trying to prove morphic resonance, so they were just interested in bird behaviour.
Empirical
So they
behaviour.
it was purely empirical. They had no theory to explain this.
Yeah.
And then during the Second World War, the delivery of milk stopped because of the war, and blue tits only lived for a few years. So after the war, there wouldn't have been any blue tits that still remembered the golden age of free cream before the war. And yet the habit started again all over Britain, and the same happened in the Netherlands. After the war, it started again very rapidly in the Netherlands. So here we have the spread of a habit that could have been because of morphic resonance, the collective memory.
No, I can't say for certain that is what's going on, but I think it's a darn good explanation and an extremely fascinating one as such. I mentioned that not everyone welcomed Rupert's theories, and in fact, he gave a TED talk that was banned. Rupert gave a talk entitled The Science Delusion at TEDx Whitechapel, January 12, 2013. The theme for the night was Visions for Transition, challenging existing paradigms and redefining values for a more beautiful world. What a beautiful title. In response to protests from two hardcore materialists in the US, the talk was taken out of circulation by TED, relegated to a corner of their website, and stamped with a warning label. Isn't that interesting? Let me play you a clip from that banned TED Talk.
Dogma 6, biological heredity is material. Everything you inherit is in your genes or in epigenetic modifications of the genes or in cytoplasmic inheritance. It's material. Dogma 7, memories are stored inside your brain as material traces. Somehow everything you remember is in your brain in modified nerve endings, phosphorylated proteins. No one knows how it works, but nevertheless, almost everyone in the scientific world believes it must be in the brain. Dogma 8, your mind is inside your head. All your consciousness is the activity of your brain and nothing more. Dogma 9, which follows from Dogma 8, psychic phenomena like telepathy are impossible. Your thoughts and intentions cannot have any effect at a distance because your mind's inside your head. Therefore, all the apparent evidence for telepathy and other psychic phenomena is illusory. People believe these things happen, but it's just because they don't know enough about statistics, or they're deceived by coincidences, or it's wishful thinking.
And you may have noticed that Rupert was using the word dogma. But isn't that the case? Hasn't science been, at times, quite dogmatic over the centuries? Some people refusing to believe another alternate version of what may be going on. And, well, let let me now play you this next clip, which I think is superb. And this is Rupert using a little bit of humour to make his point.
Handbooks of physics list the existing fundamental constants, tell you their value. But I wanted to see if they'd changed. So I got the old volumes of physical handbooks. I went to the Patent Office Library here in London, and they're the only place I could find that kept the old volumes. Normally people throw them away when the new values come out. They throw away the old ones. When I did this, I found that the speed of light dropped between 1928 and 1945 by about 20 kilometers per second. It's a huge drop because they're given with errors of only fractions of decimal points of error. And yet, all over the world, it dropped, and they were all getting values very similar to each other with tiny errors. And then in 1945, it went up, 48, it went up again. And then people started getting very similar values again. I was very intrigued by this, and I couldn't make sense of it. So I went to see the head of metrology at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. Metrology is the science in which people measure constants. And I asked him about this. I said, what do you make of this drop in the speed of light between 1928 and 1945? And he said, oh dear, he said, you've uncovered the most embarrassing episode in the history of our science. So I said, well, could the speed of light have actually dropped? And that would have amazing implications if so. He said, no, of course it couldn't have actually dropped. It's a constant. So, well then how do you explain the fact everyone was finding it going much slower during that period? Is it because they were fudging their results to get what they thought other people should be getting, and the whole thing was just produced in the minds of physicists? We don't like to use the word fudge. I said, well, what do you prefer? He said, well, we prefer to call it intellectual phase locking. So I said, well, if it was going on then, how can we be so sure it's not going on today? And that the present values are produced by intellectual phase locking. And he said, oh, we know that's not the case. I said, how do we know? He said, we've solved the problem. And I said, well, how? He said, well, we fixed the speed of light by definition in 1972. So I said, but it might still change. He said, yes, but we'd never know it because we've defined the meter in terms of the speed of light. So the units had changed with it. So he looked very pleased about that. They'd fixed that problem.
And I have to say that not only is that extremely amusing, it's also very impactful and food for thought. What I'd like to do now is to play you a clip of Stephen Mayer, who is talking to Joe Rogan about Darwin, or Darwinian evolutionary theory. See what you make of this.
We now know, thanks to the genetic revolution, the molecular biological revolution, that if you want to build a new form of life, you have to have new code, because all new forms of life depend upon new anatomical, a fundamentally new type of animal, for example. So you need new anatomical structures but the new anatomical structures require new cell types. New types. So if you got animals that first come on the line and they have a digestive system, they have a gut. Well, you got to have enzymes that can service a gut, that can process food. In our computer world, we know that if you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of digital code, you're going to degrade the function of that code long before you come up with a new string for making a new program or operating system. Now, the Darwinian mechanism starts with the idea that there are random changes in those digital bit strings, those sequences of A's, C's, G's, and T's. And based on our experience in the computer world, we would expect that random changes are going to, again, degrade those strings long before they're capable of building a new protein. And there's now very compelling experimental evidence that that's true.
And I think that neatly summarizes some of the shortcomings of neo-Darwinian theory. I mentioned telepathy earlier, and what I want to do now is to play you a clip of Rupert talking about whether telepathy is real or not.
In research on telephone telepathy, what we do is experiments in which the subject has a number of callers. Minimum number is 2. We've mainly done these experiments with 4 callers. They choose 4 people that they know well, usually friends or family members. They sit being filmed in a room with a landline telephone with no caller ID display. We pick one of the 4 callers at random and ask them to call the subject. The phone rings. They know it's one of these 4 people, but they have to guess who it is before they pick it up. So they may say, I think it's Timothy. They pick it up, say, hello, Timothy. They're right or they're wrong. By chance, they'd be right about 1 time in 4, 25% of the time. In fact, in hundreds of these trials, the score rate is about 45%.
That percentage increase is huge. For me, it implies there's definitely something going on. I know that there are people around who just don't believe telepathy exists at all. For what it's worth, I'm 100% certain that it does. One experiment that he set up was about a dog called JT and Pam, JT's owner. And this was about pets and their knowledge, their sense that their owners were coming home. Pets seem to know, irrespective of time or cues and clues from engine noises or perhaps someone walking by before the owner comes home, they've recognised this other individual, and so on. All sorts of things could give a dog a clue that their owner was coming home. Rupert, as best he could, took out all of those confounders, if I could call them that, and concluded that pets do know when their owners are coming home. More often than not. Not necessarily every pet, every time, but again, there's something in there that is statistically significant. I believe as well that we have a telepathic bond with some animals and pets, for sure. But anyway, Richard Wiseman was then invited to look at Rupert's work. Now, Richard Wiseman is a skeptic of anything paranormal. A friend of Darren Brown's, in fact, or at least he used to be last time I read anything about them. And Darren Brown is also a skeptic. Now, I think being skeptical is a good thing. I think critically thinking about situations to avoid being duped, etc., is essential. So I'm not arguing that Richard Wiseman's work as a skeptic isn't valid. It absolutely is. In fact, I talked about Richard Wiseman in another video where I reviewed, as it were, his book, The Luck Factor, and I think that book is really good. It's excellent. It's food for thought. So it's not to denigrate Richard Wiseman, but I have to say his approach to this particular experiment was, in my opinion, odd. Let me quote from Rupert Sheldrake himself. When my experiments with JT were first publicised in Britain in 1994, journalists sought out a skeptic to comment on them, and Richard Wiseman was an obvious choice. He put forward a number of points that I had already taken into account, suggesting that JT was responding to routines or car sounds or subtle cues. But rather than argue academically, I suggested that he carry out some experiments with JT himself and arranged for him to do so. I had already been doing videotaped experiments with this dog for months, and I lent him my video camera. Pam Smart, JT's owner, and her family kindly agreed to help him. With the help of his assistant, Matthew Smith, he did 4 experiments with JT, 2 in June and 2 in December 1995. And in all of them, JT went to the window to wait for Pam when she was indeed on her way home. As in my own experiments, he sometimes went to the window at other times. I think that means JT and not necessarily Richard Wiseman, but one can never be sure. For example, to bark at passing cars. But he was at the window far more when Pam was on her way home than when she was not. In the 3 experiments Wiseman did in Pam's parents' flat, JT, and listen to this, was at the window an average of 4% of the time during the main period of Pam's absence, and 78% of the time when Pam was on her way home. The difference was statistically significant. I would say so. When Wiseman's data were plotted on graphs, they showed essentially the same pattern as my own. So let's go on. In other words, Wiseman replicated my own results. I was astonished to hear that in the summer of 1996, Wiseman went to a series of conferences, including the World Skeptics Congress, announcing that he had refuted the psychic pet phenomenon. He said JT had failed his tests because he had gone to the window before Pam set off to come home. Richard, really? That's kind of irrelevant. Anyway, in September 96, I met Wiseman and pointed out that the data showed the same pattern as my own, and that far from refuting the effect I had observed, his results confirmed it. I gave him copies of graphs showing my own data and the data from the experiments that he and Smith conducted with JT. But he ignored these facts. Disappointing and interesting. Richard Wiseman will definitely know about confirmation bias, and he will also know about dogma. And he's intelligent. And yet I can't help but think that here is an example of dogmatic thinking. He's gone in, it would seem, knowing that there's no way this dog and this owner can be telepathic. It just can't happen. And so I'm not going to see it, even if I get the same results. Now, Richard Wiseman may well, of course, have a different opinion in all of this, but I think that this particular case illustrates what Rupert has been up against over the years. And this is mild. Some of it really not nice at all. The attacks that have been brought upon him have been just astounding. People are so desperate to stick to what their worldview is that they will do, it would seem, some at least, anything to refute anyone or any theory that doesn't sit with their worldview. Let's move on then to this idea about sensing someone is staring at us. Here's a short clip.
And so is it real? Well, you're not meant to think it's real because that goes against the dogma that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain and the perceptions are inside the head. But is it testable? Well, I think it is. If when I look at you as a projection from my mind that touches you, my mind in a sense reaches out to touch you, if I look at you from behind and you don't know I'm there, could you feel that I'm looking at you? Well, as soon as you ask that question, you realize that the sense of being stared at is very common. It's now called scopaesthesia, the scientific name for it. Scop as in microscope, seeing, aesthesia, feeling, as in synesthesia, anesthesia. Scopaesthesia is extremely common. Most people have experienced it. I'm sure most people in this room have experienced it. You turn around, you find someone's looking at you, or you stare at someone and they turn around and look back. Doesn't happen all the time, but it's very common. Most people have experienced it, including most children. It's usually directional. You turn and look straight at the person. You don't just feel uneasy and search around. I have a recent paper on directional scopaesthesia showing that on the basis of 960 case studies, the directionality is just a basic feature of this and the way people experience it. I've investigated the natural history. We've interviewed, we've dealt with through questionnaires. We found it typically happens most powerfully with strangers, often with male strangers in situations that could be vaguely threatening. We've done interviews with more than 50 surveillance officers, celebrity photographers, and private detectives, practically all of whom just take this for granted. if you've ever trained to be a private detective, and I'm guessing that most of you haven't, you will have learned that when you're following someone, shadowing somebody, you don't stare at their back, because if you do, they'll turn around, catch your eyes, and your cover's blown. You have to look at them a little bit, otherwise you lose them, but you look at their feet. So among practical people, these things are completely taken for granted.
And now I think it might be useful to talk about memory. I'm going to play you part of a conversation between Dr Sheldrake and Dr Alex Gomez-Marin, who's a neuroscientist. And just before the part that we're going to join the conversation, they had been discussing where memory lies. And Dr Sheldrake had been pointing out that in certain experiments with animals, I don't want to be too graphic, then if certain parts of the brain were not there, memory still appeared to be there. It was hard to pin down exactly where memory lay in the brain. And Alex, the neuroscientist, was also saying the same thing, that when asked the question, have you found in the brain where memory is, the answer is yes and no. So this is not about suggesting the brain doesn't play a role in memory. There just seems to be more to it than that. And different parts of the brain appear to be responsible for encoding certain types of memories. And yet, something else is at play. Watch this.
And they're distributed wave patterns. And one of the most interesting things, I think, in recent brain research is the phenomenon of representational drift, where they find when animals remember something, there's a particular pattern, a rather complex wave pattern in the brain. And when they remember it again, you see the same wave pattern, but it's not necessarily in the same place. So it can move from one part of the brain to the other. What's important is the wave pattern, not the exact cells. And so the idea that memory is stored by modifying nerve endings or changing proteins in cells that are involved in engrams, supposedly, the idea there would be physical material memory traces localized in particular regions, is not at all supported by this. What is supported is the idea that there are wave patterns, and the wave patterns are the key thing, and those can move around. And so the brain it doesn't have to be in a particular place. So then the question comes, if memory depends on wave patterns, how are wave patterns remembered? Because to make an engram, you've got to freeze a wave pattern. You've got to freeze it and make it static to have stuff like on a flash drive or on a grooves of an acoustic record, 78 RPM or a long player. You've got or the magnetic patterns on a tape in a tape recorder. You've got to freeze the sound or the wave pattern, make it static, and then you've got to reanimate it. But how you would freeze a wave pattern and then reanimate it in another part of the brain is totally unexplained by this research.
Yes.
And it points to something else going on that's not just freezing memory traces in synapses or in proteins or in cell membranes or even in DNA.
Yes. We're saying much more. Actually, you've been saying much more for many years. So
these wave patterns that were discussed, in my mind, are a little bit like Christmas tree lights, in the sense that if you've ever seen someone with Christmas tree lights, maybe it was you, and they can put them on this sort of automated cycle where some lights light up or some lights change colour, and they go through this kind of wave of change. And if I wanted to capture what the exact rendition of those Christmas tree lights was in one of those particular states, in one wave pattern, I could take a photograph. But that photograph wouldn't replicate much about what was actually going on. The amperage, the volt, the electromagnetic activity, etc. It wouldn't tell me. And if I wanted to freeze that light in that position, those lights in that position, then yeah, maybe in terms of the Christmas tree lights, I could pause it at that point. But you can't do that with the brain. And to use a photograph to act as some kind of facsimile for what was going on would give me not a lot of information, or not all the information. And if I wanted to, once the Christmas tree lights moved on and other wave patterns were visible, if I wanted to reactivate those lights in that exact pattern, then with Christmas tree lights, it is feasible that I could wait until it got to that particular point in the pattern sequence and pause the Christmas tree lights. I don't know if many Christmas tree lights can be paused, but let's presume that they could. But with the brain, try doing the same thing. These wave patterns are moving and changing. So first of all, how would we pause them and record them? Like the photograph doesn't work. It would be even harder with the brain, one would presume. And then how would we revivify, reactivate this pattern in the brain? Where would it come from? How could it be activated when it's so, let's say, in a state of constant change and transition? And I mean, that is a big mystery, and it is hugely intriguing. And so the implication could be that maybe there's something, just like the mind can be outside of the brain, maybe this is something to do with these morphic fields, and that somehow there is an interaction with an invisible field or fields, and many fields are invisible, to us at least, that allowed memory to be there, and that maybe that engram, as it was called in the interview, the snapshot, could be brought back in, or at least placed in that morphic field. I will be following that research closely, because we just do not understand. It's so much about the brain, and certainly memory and consciousness. And to bring things to a conclusion then, I'll give you my ideas, and I'll tell you a bit about that funny reason that Dr. Sheldrake may be even busier than normal. My thoughts on morphic fields and morphic resonance are as follows: that the best explanation for a lot of stuff that we see out there, including Carl Jung's collective unconscious, and I believe that rather than life appearing and being pushed out from like an acorn, it's pulled out. There is an energy in the ether, so to speak, that knows the shape and form of a tree and pulls it out. And you may think, well, that's kind of what Rupert Sheldrake was saying. Yeah, I mean, he's saying it in a far more articulate way, of course. But I've had that feeling for a long time. And that in terms of other planets and life out there, it's not Earth-centric whatsoever. Given half a chance, look at the planet, life will appear. It's being encouraged somehow, some field. And I think it is the same out there. It may not be life as we know it, Jim, but it's life. And I think that the universe itself is buzzing with the capacity to pull life out in the right conditions on different planets, and goodness knows where. And if you then consider also where we get that innate information, that innate knowledge that some of us appear to have, like, for example, how does a dog know it's another dog? A dog will react very often differently to another dog than it will do to a person or to a cat. And you may say, well, but it recognizes it. Okay, where's the memory for recognition? Where is that template? And it smells it. Yeah, okay, maybe it recognizes another dog through smell, but what is that pattern out there matching to in the brain? Where's that from? And if you then consider small babies, they've been shown to mimic at an extremely young age. You know, the mum may stick out her tongue, and the baby mimics sticking out the baby's tongue. How does it know it's looking at a face? How does it know that's a tongue on a face? And how does a baby know that this is its tongue and it should stick it out? Where's that information held? Some people suggest, again, it's in those fields. And I've heard other people talk about REM sleep, and that you can see this REM sleep happening at a very young age. And indeed, with the fetus, could that be a download? I don't know. But I love these questions, and we need to explore them. What I would also say is that one of the implications about morphic fields is that we input to them. To these memories that are there in that field are not only can they be drawn from, but we put stuff back in. And I've talked about for years the need for all of us to do the right thing. And I've used that description of integrity being doing the right thing when no one else is looking. And I've questioned it myself and thought that feels like we should be doing that. But if no one else knows, does it make a difference? And what I've said about that is that when we do the right thing, morally, ethically, in a decent manner, then we are in effect putting a building block back into, or perhaps creating one that wasn't there at all, into the buttresses, the flying buttress that props up our culture, our society, our family, our country, our planet. And maybe that's what it is. Maybe in doing good, we add good into that morphic field. And so when other individuals pull down that information, then they have the capacity to access the good part of humanity. And of course, the flip side would be true. Anyway, back to Rupert Sheldrake. I noticed yesterday, I happened to click on it and thought, should I watch this? And it was Charlie Brooker of Black Mirror anthology fame, his Conk on Earth show with Philomena herself. And lo and behold, as I skipped through it, I went, hold on a second. That's Rupert Sheldrake. So there he was. I'd been in contact with him, hadn't a clue he had been or is on Conk on Earth, and I wonder if that little bit of extra PR has caused maybe a frenzy around trying to liaise with him and chat to him. He was busy already, and he didn't need that. But again, it's lovely to see, because when you consider some of those attacks that he has faced over the years, then to have him so widely accepted, or at least accepted by more and more people, is heartwarming, to say the least.
I'm going to go straight in at the deep end. Is there a God?
Yes.
Oh, that was quick. Great. Has anyone proved it?
No, except to their own satisfaction.
Does God have a brother called Simon?
No.
But they can't prove that either, so he might have. The universe could have been created by Simon.
And like Columbo, just one more thing. If you've watched it thus far, thank you very much. If you are a subscriber, thank you very much indeed. If you have watched this and you don't subscribe, please consider subscribing. It makes a huge difference behind the scenes in very many different ways, and it would be very much appreciated. But as I say, if you are already subscribing, you are very much appreciated. For the moment, from me, bye for now.